AI makes it very easy to tackle low-hanging fruit, but low-hanging fruit isn't always something that provides a lot of leverage or compounding over time. And so when I'm helping people shape projects, some of the ways that I'm trying to direct the work that gets done is asking them like, okay, like what does this build into or what does this enable next?
Welcome back to the Staff Bench podcast. I am Alex, your host, here with David,
Hey everyone.
and our guest this week is Jonathan. Jonathan, would you care to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, my name's Jonathan. I'm a Staff Plus engineer at Block, where I work on an API platform and some internal tools. Been a founder in the past, worked at Stripe for a short period of time, and been director at engineering at some startups. And yeah, I'm excited to be here on the podcast and to talk with both of you.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. Sort of how we've been starting is maybe I'll use the new language of we're in the singularity now, right? So can you help us understand maybe like the first time you felt the singularity personally?
Yeah, I think that it really became much more clear that we were in the singularity around the holidays in 2025 when Opus 4.6 landed and it went from like, okay, we can build tools that are better and help us go faster to, wow, this helps me one shot quite a bit. And so I think that shift has really been profound. And, it's been from on a personal level from being able to take side projects and just rewrite them in a couple hours when they had been labors of love over the course of weeks or months in the past to just being at work and being able to use an agent loop to tackle things that were just previously in the backlog perpetually because of the scale relative to their priority level. And yeah, it just feels like what can be done today is far more wild than it was in months or years past.
Is there a particular project or something that has stood out as like that moment where you were like, oh my goodness, this changes everything?
Yeah, it's in like one thing that really did wow me, and it's very mundane, was we had like a mono repo at work, and I needed to update something that would have touched 60 different services, and it was just something that had sat in the backlog of, this will become important enough when there's some sort of like security bundle that forces us to do the update. But then in the midst of doing other work, I had an agent start churning away on it. And in the course of a couple of days, with a little bit of prodding and the CI infrastructure chugging along alongside of it, giving it feedback, it was able to mostly do it. And then it was also able to handle like with guidance, the release process for it. So being able to look through like, 4,000 files changed and determine like what are the common patterns and then what are the teams that we should communicate with about what those different changes meant to their systems and how to watch out for any issues. And so just seeing with minimal guidance, being able to take on large scale code changes like that, where each individual instance was bespoke in its own way, was really encouraging in terms of determining like, okay, we need to be raising our ambitions in terms of what we can be doing day to day with these tools. And then, everything has been, exciting to see from that point on forwards.
That's really cool. There's a lot to dig in there. I'm curious if we go back a little bit. Like, how did you find yourself adopting these tools in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
Did you have any of those early feelings of like, oh no, this is going to replace me? How did you get here to this point where you're like, this is helpful and productive?
Yeah, AI has been a journey of fits and starts for me personally. I think if we go back to late 2024, like the tools are available, but they really did thrive more in that like single line or single function level of generation, where it's like, okay, this is useful. It helps me go 10 to 20% faster, but it's not really threatening to my profession at this stage. And so I would test out tools maybe like every 4 to 6 weeks and figure out which to incorporate, which to, set aside for now. And there were periods where it felt like they needed time to bake or time to mature before really fully implementing. And so I was a skeptic at first, and I remember having a meeting with somebody who was a bit more forward on the adoption curve than I was, and them telling me I don't use my IDE anymore. This was before Opus 4.6, and I was very like, wow, like I don't think I'm there yet. And then 3 to 4 months later, I was like, okay, like I see what you were saying, and the points of leverage that I'm trying to apply personally to anything I'm building have shifted substantially from just writing code to thinking and working at different levels of abstraction typically.
Yeah. So like if like as you've been on this personal journey, I'm curious like how have you helped like the people you work with go on the same journey?
Hmm.
Like especially like if there's any practices or anything that you've done that you feel like has like really helped diffuse
Hmm.
LLMs through your work.
Yeah, I think trying to lead with curiosity and engagement on these things is the main way that I've been approaching a lot of the work. I think that there is, like, the genie's out of the bottle. Like, there isn't a way that we're going to be able to go backwards in this regard. And so, trying to use the tools as much as possible, engage internally within the community of builders at Block, and then externally outside of the company with other engineering leaders attempting to use the tools and to encourage adoption. I think what I've found to be the most helpful day to day has been honestly just experimenting and then demoing and going through that loop of showing people how I'm building with these tools to and asking questions. How are other people doing it? And I think that there's a lot to learn from other people that are running experiments and trying new things. And there's so much to experiment with right now. I think that just being open to new ways of operating and new techniques and then experimenting with them almost immediately is my main approach at the moment.
Cool. Can you remember a specific demo that you felt like really sang in the
Really
moment?
saying, yeah, I think I was, at least in my immediate cohort, or like the people around me, I was one of the first adopters of tools similar to Conductor and trying to work on multiple threads at one time. I think people were pretty familiar with using Cloud Code or Codex and having an agentic experience. And by no means the first person in the wild to do this, but when I did a demo of showing like, okay, like, I've started this conversation and it's going to take a couple of minutes to work. And then I'm going to find this other thing on our backlog and I'm going to start another session with it. And I think people started to realize how much more they could be doing concurrently. And that was one thing where I saw like a community of skeptics become a community of adopters inside of the teams around me.
Block in particular has, of course, made a lot of kind of public statements around the impact that AI has had
Hmm.
on the organization. I'm curious, from your perspective in day to day, what are the like? How does AI change the way that you work, and especially in the context of like a group of engineers trying to get things done? Because I think a lot of what we're seeing, or a lot of like what the sort of popular discourse around AI
Hmm.
tooling today is that it's still fairly single player, whereas companies are obviously a multiplayer endeavor. What do you like? What
Yeah, I that's actually been a point of emphasis for me personally in like how I've been talking to teams recently is that I think it's a question we're still seeking to answer, where AI does help create incredible velocity for individual engineers. And I think that, like as you said, engineering is still very multiplayer, and so we need to find ways for it to help us collaborate as much as just go faster individually. So I think, companies are trying to pull in the same direction together, and that's how they tend to succeed and find compounding benefits. But it's an interesting tension because I think as an industry, we've seen more layoffs across the industry, and a lot of them are attributed to AI. And so there's a pressure to go faster. And so I think that there's what is that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. I think that there's a certain element of that we can continue to try to apply to teams with AI. And I think that even though AI is helping us go faster, finding the opportunities to build human touch points into that process is really important, whether that is engineering designs and reviews or somebody YOLOing a POC in like an afternoon, but then taking the time to actually either show it to other engineers, show it to product people, show it to designers and get feedback on it and incorporate it. I think that there's still a refinement and a distillation process that's really important to work cross-functionally, even as you are using AI for more and more parts of the process. Because I think that at Block, we really emphasize taste and judgment, and that being the element that humans bring into this AI landscape. And I think that AI helps us, experts can be even more empowered when using AI because we're more able to catch the the hallucinations or the things that sound really right, but they also help anyone look like an expert, even when they're not. So I can create something that looks really good as a design, but if I hand that to a designer, they can almost immediately see, here are all of the ergonomic issues with that, or like why you might not want to do something in a certain way, or it doesn't adhere with our brand guidelines in another way. Same thing if I was to give that to a copywriter or to a product person and doesn't understand necessarily how it bakes into our overall ecosystem of products. And so I think finding ways to connect with people so that they can involve their taste and judgment in the process as well helps refine things in a very important way. But those human touch points are probably the most critical element of doing AI well, I think.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear if you're like what I'm getting the sense of is like there's things that are going well and there's things where we're like, oh, this should be better, but it's not better.
Hmm.
Right? Like
Yeah.
I think I've had a similar experience to you where I had this like big migration project where I had to like take this old deprecated code mechanism and use a new code mechanism. Threw an agent at it, hundreds of thousands of lines of code, and it just went. And like
Hmm.
really my biggest problem was like getting it through the pull request review queue at that point. Like literally just
Yeah.
getting, but then I had a similar experience where I had this POC where I have some tests and I have public documentation and I want the thing in the public documentation to literally get checked in CI.
Hmm.
It POC'd in like a day, but
Hmm.
then I had to go and meticulously understand how it did it and find like, oh, it's like doing a weird regex over here. Like I don't want that to go into production,
Yeah.
and like, I had to like then apply my level of taste. And if I look at that project, like it POC'd very quickly,
Hmm.
but then the level of like refinement has maybe taken just as long as it would have, quote unquote, normally. So I'm
Yeah.
curious, like, what's working for you, and where are you like, well, I feel like it should help, but it's not helping yet.
Yeah. I've seen a couple of very public projects where they have rewritten uh, what's it called? They've rewritten a project using AI in very short periods of time. I think somebody had rewritten Next.js very quickly, and then somebody had recently rewritten Bun in Rust from Zig. And I think when you have these environments where you have very good tests and you can usually get a final product that gives you a fairly high degree of confidence that it's going to work pretty well. Even the Vercel one, though, I think the actual authors had come back and done some prodding at it with their baked in expertise and found that, like it was maybe 95% of the way, but that final 5% is actually pretty important. I work on APIs a lot internally, and it's been a process of trying to build up better guardrails over time where we might be designing the APIs and having people go through an internal review process for them. A lot of those rules can be codified in some way or given to a skill for agents. But we are still trying to find ways to go faster on all of these things too. And like each model change, you might get different results with it. And so having evals in place and being able to quickly judge, like how do you react to a model change, and then being able to tune things in a certain way over time to get more accurate results is really important.
That's really cool. How are you all orchestrating evals to make sure that the like, is it
Mhm.
are you evaling like prompts or agents or like like what is it under eval?
Yeah, it would just depend on the domain. I think recently Square announced a product called ManagerBot, which helps sellers be able to operate or run their business in certain ways. And so we have reporting elements baked into it. We have ways of managing a product catalog baked into it. And so there are fairly typical flows we might see customers try and accomplish. And we know what a prompt might look like, whether that is, I want to like we're out of an ingredient, so we need to 86 an item. And so we're going to be able to change the status of that in a given conversation. And so going from very short prompt to actual actions taken in a system and getting high degrees of confidence in that. Usually those types of prompts will be encoded and as the corpus of sessions from users becomes larger and larger, we're able to capture more of those individual, like the ways that people might express their expectations and then build evals around them to make sure that we are doing things that are expected even in a rather like probabilistic or stochastic environment.
When you run the evals, I guess like, and sorry, Alex, maybe I'm just kind of rephrasing your question, but are you at what layer of the sort of like agent loop are you evaluating the response? Is it purely like when an LLM is given this system prompt and this user prompt, this is like the output that we get, and then that's iterating on like the system prompt for the
Hmm.
manager bot in the case in question? Or are you actually like, here's an agent with a bunch of tools, we're sending a prompt in and we're asserting that the like side effects from the tools are what we expected?
Yeah, it's usually around what tool is called and with which inputs. Yeah.
That makes sense. Cool.
I'm curious, like, in the environment like that, how are you determining, yes, this did what we expected the user to do, and therefore we can use this as a model for a future evaluation? Like, how do you know that the thing did the right thing in the first place?
Yeah, that is still often a human-driven process that we have a large catalog of these sessions, and it's not unusual for engineers to dive in and read the sessions and try and determine, you know, did this go according to expectations? Because I think that as people were able to judge that conversation very instantaneously and determine did the user get what they expected, and then the owners of these different domains, they're able to go in and apply, take the learnings from that session and apply it as an eval. And it's been, a scaling process internally to find ways to get those relevant sessions into the hands of domain owners and help shape the evals. And I think the interesting thing working with consumer-facing products is that the possibility of what users might say or expect from a given session is nearly infinite. And so finding ways to cover as much of that as possible almost necessitates an AI-driven process, but it's a balance between using human judgment again alongside AI to scale the outputs.
That's cool. Have you all tried to create and like antagonistic prompts that like force the agent like pretend to be the human and like go really orthogonal on the process?
Yeah, that's something I've been personally experimenting with recently, where the bottleneck for myself has been code review, both like at an individual and at a team level. And one of the ways, like we started with agent skills to try and bring in the rules for different spaces to help tailor exactly what an agent should be looking at in that code review process. But we've been leaning more into the adversarial element of it and trying to find, like either using a different model, like use Opus 4.7 for generating the code and Codex 5.5 for doing the code review, but also using multiple agents for both of those things and almost applying, like an evolutionary pressure is almost the right way to think about it, where you have outputs and you are applying some sort of fitness test to those things, and maybe even using different generations or different branches of the possible code generated to come to whatever you think the best output might be. And I think you can have that both at a individual engineering level, and you can start to apply that more broadly as well by giving engineers the tools to have that baked into their own process.
That's really cool. Sort of switching topics. You mentioned something earlier in your sort of journey about starting to ask the question of like, how do we raise ambition with these
Mm-hmm.
tools? And like that's a conversation I've started having with some of my coworkers as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, like, how's that going for you? Are you finding people to be like, yeah, like, let's go? Are you finding people who are sort of critical of that? I'm just curious how you feel like that conversation is going.
Yeah, I think it depends on the person and the day. It can vary quite a bit. I think initially the reaction often is skepticism, and what most often tends to unblock some of those conversations is getting them to do something larger than they thought was possible in the current moment and spending a little bit of time pair programming on those things. Like I think it's funny how often I feel like I'm going back to practices and patterns that were effective before AI to help either communicate or to apply additional rigor. But I think that pair programming with somebody on a larger idea or doing a demo to a group of people in a live session and seeing the output that you can get and like being honest about the constraints or that gap between POC and productionizing something. And but yeah, I think having one-on-one meetings with people, figure out, if you could wave a magic wand and see something done, and then find their answer. Like we actually have that magic wand in a lot of contexts right now, which I think is very interesting in terms of not so much like what do we do with that magic wand, but like what do we choose not to do with it, and how do we prioritize like our attention.
So, like, do you have like a model of what elevating ambition looks like for your team? You know, like for instance, we've had conversations around like, well, we have these ladders.
Yeah.
It makes sense for us to say, well, you as a person at a specific level, we kind of expect spiking into like
Hmm.
just more often or something like that. You know what I mean? Like taking it back literally to like trying to create an objective understanding of performance and ambition and all that stuff, like, and not trying to just sort of like vibe it out, right? I'm
Yeah.
curious, like, if you had conversations like that.
It's still been something I've been working through. Are like I think one of the traps that I see and trying to encourage people to avoid is that AI makes it very easy to tackle low-hanging fruit, but low-hanging fruit isn't always something that provides a lot of leverage or compounding over time. And so when I'm helping people shape projects, some of the ways that I'm trying to direct the work that gets done is asking them like, okay, like what does this build into, or what does this enable next, or 3 months down the road, 6 months down the road. And I think that that's an important consideration of like, don't just do something that seems nice to have done and out of the way, but try and figure out if the models improve another step function or two in the coming year, what will this have unlocked, or like what friction will this have reduced so that we can continue to accelerate. I think those are important considerations, and thinking not just as an engineer, but almost as a business person or a product person too, of like what are the related unlocks around doing this engineering work. And I think that as the specific skills of software engineering become something that agents can very much do for us, I think that we have to be considering, what that work fits into larger picture.
Yeah, there's like any wave of technology, right? You get these
Hmm.
early adopters, but then there has to be this sort of like diffusion process,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And like a model that I always have in my head is like somebody who like built around like the steam engine and then
Hmm.
like electrification came out or something like that. And
Hmm.
it's like, you're like, well, I bought all my tools for like
Yeah,
pneumatics, steam, right? I'm not going to reinvest. It sounds like what you're saying here is that like to some degree, we have to start figuring out how to literally change our systems such that
hmm
they are more available or easier to change with AI.
yeah. I think that's very true. I think as a profession, it's always been very learning oriented, and so I think that that's going to have to continue. And I mentioned early on being prioritizing curiosity and engagement. I think that they're just, if you want to stay relevant, then you have to continue to be investing in learning and experimentation. And sometimes you might build a tool that becomes obsolete in the next 6 months. I started my career in character animation instead of software engineering, and one of the my favorite axioms from screenwriting is like murder your darlings. And that means like you might love an idea, it might be really like precious to you, but it might not work for the story that needs to be told. And so you can't, sacrifice the entire project for the sake of that one idea. The same thing applies here, is that like it's very easy to become identified professionally with the work that you do day in and day out. But I think that we also have to realize that we're working towards outcomes rather than the specific thing that we might build on a given week or month. And so we should be ready to adopt new techniques, new tools, new implementations in order to accomplish those outcomes, even as we just spent a lot of time in the previous iteration of it.
Yeah, I feel like the old adage of like code is read more than it is written.
Yeah.
And like I think that we're gonna have to change that to be like code is read by LLMs more than it is read by humans.
Hmm.
Or something like that. And so if that's true, like is there something that we can do there that improves the ability for comprehension inside of LLMs or something like that?
Yeah. I don't know about comprehension. I'll admit I'm much more on the software engineering side than on the inference engineering side. So in terms of their comprehension, I would defer to actual experts on it. But I think like what's been very top of mind for me recently has been Daniel Kahneman's like system one and system two thinking, of like thinking fast and slow, where I think that Agents, I think, are really, really good at what we would consider fast thinking, where things that can be automated or like there are familiar patterns for, or things that are like massively reproduced. I think we can really lean on agents in those spaces. And I think that for the system two thinking that require like analysis and logic and deliberation and compromise or collaboration, I think those are where software engineering really has the most leverage and that we're able to lean in and apply still. And agents are still tremendous at being able to research things. Like for example, being able to point an agent at your Datadog skill and, find out patterns that correlate across spans for a given platform or system. Just would have taken, days or weeks of individual effort in the past is now like a 10-minute prompt session. So there's a lot of value from the tools, but I think that bucketing those things in kind of two places, either things that you don't have to pay close attention to, like a dependency upgrade and like, okay, the tests all passed and our staging canary did well, versus things that we should really be deliberate about and pay attention to, like data modeling or system design or architecture, and finding the balance of how to apply tools in both of those, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. Like the long arc of software engineering is even we keep moving to higher and higher layers of abstraction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like assembly to like, and so forth. And so now many of us are working in interpretive languages or just like easier to read, easier to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're sort of looking at is like, yeah, like why can't we like even go like a level higher and just say like, this is the domain. Here are the models.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the business functioning. I'm going to
Yes.
pay attention to this. As long as this stuff keeps working and producing value for
Mm-hmm.
that people over there, then you're
Yeah.
going in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think we can build more confidence around that type of operation by having the right guardrails in place. Like I think at a certain point, your pager isn't going to lie when you're on call. Like the metrics in the system, like your latency won't lie to you. That's also where expertise and I think the jump from like junior engineers to senior engineers is really like it plays out, because you can see in certain implementation patterns where something is likely to fail or not. And being able to help avoid those pitfalls early on really allows you to take advantage of the compounding effects of doing things well over time.
Is there like, have you done any projects where you felt like you've moved the world closer to this world where you're just paying attention like largely to the outcomes and the operating of your system?
Yeah, I gave a talk about this last year at GraphQL Summit, and we've continued to iterate on the project. But the API platform I mentioned is GraphQL focused, and so we've taken like a lot of the public REST endpoints for Square's APIs and started to build a graph out of those things. And it started pre Opus 4.6 and has been something we've worked on continually after it, but it is a place where, you know, API design, tastes, and domain design are very important. Like getting the individual pieces correct plays out just like over years in terms of the consumers of those things and the systems that you can build with them. So spending a lot of time on the review process more than on, because it's GraphQL, what the underlying resolvers might look like has been very impactful. Like there are some areas where the resolvers are still important. Like if you're doing search or getting a large number of entities at a given time, you need to pay attention to how those are organized and how those are accessed. But the API design principles, being able to make sure they're applied, in a way that expresses what we're building very well, rather than in the generic, close but not quite right way that an agent might apply those, has been very important.
That's interesting. Like, just I'm trying to understand a little bit more how these systems interplay. So I'm going to ask you a little bit more like
Yeah, please.
some low level questions here. I'm not familiar with the
Mm-hmm.
block GraphQL API, but do you have
Yes.
some sort of like systems invariants that,
Mm-hmm.
for instance, prevent people from shipping unpaginated list endpoints?
Yeah, that would be a pretty good example, and that Relay is a pattern that came out of, I think, Meta and following some of the patterns that they had done, but they have a very specific implementation of like cursor-based pagination. And so being able to ensure that the schema that we're shipping follows that type of pagination pattern and using linters to enforce that is one straightforward way of doing it. There are places where we have found, I'm going to call them old school tools of just linters to be very effective as guardrails. And there have been places where LLMs as judges have been very effective as well. So you might find GraphQL is very entity and relationship focused. And you might choose, like as a designer to, or as an engineer to say, I want people to interact with this relationship in a specific way. To go from something like a location, which is where Square sellers are physically based, to products. But I don't necessarily want to go from products to all the locations that that thing might be sold at, because it can be very, it can explode the number of branches and the way that you interact with the underlying system. So having, a few skills that articulate, like, here are the types of relationships that we want to express, and we want an aggregate root in terms of domain-driven design, and these are where we want to provide our entry points, can help LLMs as judges get things more correct out of the gate.
That's really cool. So what you're saying is like the rote technical pattern of relay or pagination, right? We can
Yeah,
link that. That doesn't need an LLM.
exactly.
But
Yeah.
exploring the design choices that were
hmm
made in this domain are something that you probably couldn't lint,
hmm
and then LLMs come along, but our LLMs seem pretty good at making the determination of like, oh, that's a backwards relationship that we don't want.
Yeah, exactly. And you can give them principles and then they're able to apply it. We don't apply that type of LLM as judge on every time we build an image of the system, but during the design phase or the code review phase, like, those can be very useful for sparking conversation between engineers on, like, is this the design or the pattern that we want to enforce here?
That's really cool. Do you like, is this something like, I'm trying to like, I'm like reverse modeling your business, how it works. Like, so I've been involved in API review at
hmm
Stripe for quite a while. And there's like a doc that you have to review, right? Like a doc comes up.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to dive in. You got stakeholders and everything. And I mean, so is it similar? Is there something similar at Block where you have to like review any sort of big change to the GraphQL API?
Yeah, it's gone through different generations of implementation. I think that governance is a question that is still open-ended and evolving, but I think that design review process is certainly a part of it, where you get people that are very familiar with the platform and the patterns of the schema, and you get people that are very familiar with the domain and the business logic that goes into it and how these things interrelate, and then you find ways to express the correct principles and models, and then try and figure out where we might need to be in 6 to 12 months and or longer, because the APIs do tend to live for quite a long time, and then not corner yourself too much in terms of the API design and the trade-offs that you make.
And have you found that you can like bundle up some skills that you can give to the proposal author to sort of like pre-review? Or is this
Yeah.
something API reviewers are sort of like using on their own to sort of generate the first step of feedback or something like that?
Yeah, I've seen some interesting projects where people have trained LLMs or skills based on feedback they've given previously as a way to do that pre-review. I think that there is a balance that different engineers are still finding in terms of how much do I delegate upfront to this first pass, and also being ready for the conversations in the room with other people, because I think that you can tell when somebody has outsourced thinking to an LLM coming into a session. And so I think one of the ways that you can generally probe that is by being prepared yourself and asking high quality questions. And unfortunately, you can't have an LLM do that for you all the time.
I think this is like an interesting thread. I was going to ask when we started talking about design reviews, like in the sort of first season of this show many years ago now, it came up several times that design reviews are like an organizationally contentious forum, right? Like it's not,
hmm
it's hard because you have someone who is submitting a change that solves a specific problem that's important to them, and then you basically have a bunch of other people who are there to make sure that that change doesn't mess up attributes of the
hmm
system that are important to them. And so in practice it ends up being sort of like it kind of looks like a gatekeeping exercise, I think a lot of the time.
hmm
And I think that's like I said, organizationally contentious. I think it's interesting. I think the application of LLMs in that type of forum is really, really interesting. Obviously, we've all seen a lot of the impact that we can get out of coding with LLMs, but I think my impression is that using LLMs to codify a lot of that squishy stuff might allow design reviews to eventually becoming a less contentious forum because it just feels less personal to be arguing with an LLM versus to be arguing with a person, right?
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of the types of things that come up in design reviews could, by and large, be taught to an LLM. Like, oh, these are the pieces of the system that we care about. These are the invariants that are important. This is why, and that would allow a lot of that first pass to get done. It sounds like, and all of this is purely hypothetical for me because I don't work in a big enough org these days to really get to explore that stuff. It sounds like you're saying that people are exploring it, but it's still pretty early days. Is that a fair take?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that we are exploring it from like an how the org uses it and figuring out like there is kind of a central governance body, and we're figuring out generally where LLMs play in the review process. I think you're right that LLMs being able to assess invariance might reduce some of the sense of politicking or gatekeeping or horse trading that can go along with and or like any governance body. And I think that you're right that it has always been an interesting tension between the system invariance and what somebody individually cares very deeply about because they've spent a lot of time getting into the details of it. I think there's always that trade-off of like what level are you optimizing for, and sometimes it might be that very specific domain. Sometimes it might be the system as a whole and the invariance we want to apply. And I think the agents at least can do that initial diagnosis of those different constraints and then figure out like here are the trade-offs that they recommend you discussing or diving deeper into as a group.
Yeah. What do you think? You mentioned another problem of like people kind of overly outsourcing their thinking to LLMs, and I don't think that's unique to design reviews. I think it happens all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think the antidote to that is?
Wow, that is a big question. I don't think I have a universal one. I think for myself, it does often return to asking questions and pressure testing things and figuring out, like I think I mentioned like pagers don't lie or metrics don't lie. And I realize you can lie with statistics in a majority in like, very many ways, but there are ways to get to the ground truth of things, and asking hard questions in reviews is often probably the lever I use the most where, you know, that's my way of applying external pressure testing to something else that somebody has created. That can be, have you thought of X, Y, or how it will handle X, Y, or Z? How does this scale to a certain degree? But I think that, you know, there's so much happening so fast now that finding ways to, like your own touch points for evaluating signal versus noise is really important. And I think that will vary from person to person and how you learn and how you communicate and how you operate. Yeah, I'm curious if either of you have patterns that you've found valuable for those things.
The advice that I've given people is fight fire with fire. Like if people are gonna come with like thought processes, like I might use LLMs as like my first layer of analysis, and then usually I like have to make it then, but like at that point I have to make a decision. Like, okay, did I get useful output here, or do I need to like trash that and go old school, for lack of a better term, right? You know what I mean? But try not to let someone else's choices overly impact my ability to do my job. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of a specific example. Just sort of like there's like a range of things that I've run into from, comments left on docs that are slightly wrong to like architecture design, that's like a million miles away from where we are today. And like there could be some like kernels of like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, but like at some
Hmm.
point we have to ask the question of how we get from here to there, even if that's maybe the direction we want to go eventually. Having to sort of like, and both of them like are like slightly different conversations. Like I think the distance conversation is like, hey, let's go chat real quick.
Hmm.
That's a simple one, right? Like, okay, if we want to go here, like, what are the 15 steps between here and there? And like, that's just a
Hmm.
conversation. And then the comments are more of one of like, we talk about more about valuing the outcome than how you got there,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, hey, I don't mind if you let an LLM generate comments, but like,
Hmm.
you've got to value on the hook for anything your LLM creates effectively.
Yeah. I think culture plays into what you're describing a lot. Like if you have that culture of accountability between individuals, then I think that that can work really, really well. But I think that if people are just YOLOing and not really applying that level of judgment or accountability to the outcomes, then I think it becomes very difficult to operate in.
Yeah. I've been trying to think about ways of like communicating too, like the level of LLM involvement in any
Hmm.
artifact.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I've started doing is like if I'm writing a doc and it's like a one-off quick and I want to use an LLM, I'll say like authored by my name and I'll put like the robot icon. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? Like just indicating
Yep.
like, hey, and all the way to like, hey, this is a PR that I one-shotted. Do you want to take a look at it? Like that kind of stuff. And then there's like other docs where like I will use LLMs to write every word in a doc sometimes.
Hmm.
But if it goes past a certain level of importance, or I don't know, there's just some sort of internal barometer. I have to go and read every single word and basically, like, with a check mark, be like, yep, 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 yep.
Hmm.
Like, I'm not at that point where I'm willing to have an LLM write something and then
Hmm.
in a certain level or a certain domain be like just inserted into the domain. Like, I still have to go be an editor of that document.
Yeah, I agree. I found that I'm much less precious with the code that I write or have agents write today versus when I have an agent speak for me. And so whether that's a code review comment or a doc that I'm writing, like I will much more deliberately go handwrite the majority of my docs. When I do have agent support, one of the ways I bring it back to, being self-authored is to actually read it out loud before I put it in the hands or put it in front of somebody else so that it
Hmm.
does wind up being in my voice still.
There's a great podcast that's not this one by the Every.2 company. And they've mentioned a lot how every employee in this company has their own claw basically running.
Hmm.
And they've mentioned how people will sometimes choose to go and talk to a person's claw because
Hmm.
they know that it must have the right context. So like if your
Hmm.
boss has a claw, you're like, I'm gonna just go ask my that unwarranted communication on my behalf is like I want to see that in the flesh. I haven't had a chance to do that kind of interactions before, but I'm really curious how that works in principle.
Yeah, I haven't gotten to the point where I have given my own like publicly exposed claw to the company yet. I have used it for being able to assess all of my recent projects and uh, you know, project management work and doc writing. And it does a fairly good job of being able to help me determine, like, hey, here are the things based on what you have coming up that are probably important to you today. And that's been helpful, but I think that there is also value in just using something like Obsidian with a single to-do list and a daily notes doc, where it tends to stick in your brain really well when you do something that way. And finding that balance between having more output because that's what the expectation is as the industry and finding ways to learn effectively and to get the right information into your brain so that you remember it and that you apply it is it's an interesting balance to navigate in 2026.
Hmm.
I've got two closing questions for you. I'm going to throw a new one out there that I just
Ooh.
thought about as we were chatting. Do you use like an agents.md or like a claude.md file at all?
Yes, at different levels, both like a global one and one that's often per project or per domain.
What have you found? Like, what are some of your favorite patterns that you found to use in those files to help you do your job?
Usually it's about rules. Some of them can be very mundane, like make sure that I have a task tracker ticket open for this thing as I start to work on it, because at the end of a sprint or a quarter, it's a good way of cataloging all of the things I've done over the past time period. And then for the project ones, those are often where I'm encoding invariants. So that could be like the pagination example we walked through would be one that would be in that agents MD for a project. I think some of the interesting, they're not so much agents.md, but something I've found a lot of value from recently is being able to run agents on a schedule. And so I have a prompt that will just run every single morning for the platform that I'm responsible for and say, based on the past of traffic or on the day of traffic, compare that to previous week or month and tell me anything that looks weird. And so that gives me a much better pulse than I might have just by reading a dashboard in Datadog over my morning coffee. And it has surfaced some interesting opportunities that help improve things over time.
Cool. And then the final question, we've asked this in every episode of this podcast ever. How much code are you writing nowadays?
Manually or in general?
It's really up to you how you want to answer the question.
Okay. In terms of code merged, more than ever. In terms of code manually written, less than ever. Yeah, I think my total code output has probably gone up at least 5x in the last 6 months. And in terms of the code that I'm manually writing, it's less than hundreds of lines per week now. It's usually just in the refinement process as well, rather than or tuning something rather than writing something from scratch most of the time. Yeah. How about both of you on that one?
I actually just ran the numbers last week, and we're less than halfway through the year, and I've merged more pull requests than I did all of last year.
Wow.
Absolutely writing more output. I still think I'm about 50-50 though. I guess it's hard I don't know, I'm not writing a lot of code that I don't look at. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But and then I'm writing a lot of code still where I have to go and look at every line. And so I'm not typing on the keyboard, but I'll be okay, now go make this change. And that to me feels far less it is super LLM dependent, right? But I don't get the same sense of it. In my side projects, I won't even look at the code. You know what I mean? Versus at work, I'm looking at all of it. I'm being very prescriptive about what needs to happen. There needs to be some word for this in between way of working.
Yes.
It's not YOLO, not fully manual. It's I don't know what it's called.
I've heard vibe engineering.
Okay.
Like that. Yes. Yeah. Still very heavily review quite a bit of code. That 5x has just changed from working in the IDE to maybe working in the GitHub pull request view.
I don't know. How about you, David?
I mean, it's a very different context, right? Relative to lines of code that I shipped when I was at Stripe. I mean, you'd have to look at the pre-manager versus post-manager times there. But in the startup, I think one of the things that I love the most about coding agents is that even though I have to wear sort of my a manager hat or a business hat or whatever a bunch of the time, I'm able to be generating code in the background for all of that stuff, right? I've definitely had coding agents going on during this conversation, right? And I think that's cool because it lets me sort of wear two hats. The other thing that I think is really neat, and this is something that I think is maybe unique to startups right now. I don't know, I haven't yet heard in these conversations big organizations getting to this point yet. But in the startup context, we have a pretty small eng team that basically maintains a platform, and then we have product engineers and marketers and everybody else in the company who's not a programmer vibe coding on top, right? And so when I think about sort of the force multiplier that we can have, it's not only just the amount of code that I'm shipping, but it's enabling these people who couldn't read the code if they wanted to build really rapidly on top of that. And so it's neat, and I think it's probably a preview of the way that software is going to get built everywhere. But I mean, I don't yet think that really big orgs are set up for it. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I know we're right near the end. I think one of my favorite parts of being a Block in this era has been how early they bought into making all of the tools available and setting the expectation for all roles to be leveraging them. So we do have designers, we do have legal, we do have customer support that are all building these things and are building with these tools, and not just for their roles, but also creating utilities. Like we've had API contributions from people in one service that needed something exposed in a different one that were not engineers at all. And so I think that that will become more the norm over time. And it's exciting to be in a place where that is, the expectation has been set for that.
I can tell you about a failed experiment recently of like trying to enable non-programmers to engage. We've been working to help our design team. Like the way that I describe this is I want them to do whatever they want that they think will do a better job for our users, right? But one of the things that I've always had to do as an engineer is help them understand how big of a check they are writing in any given moment.
Mm-hmm.
That's always the hard part, right? And so I was like, what if I spend all this time to like document all the code paths, all the protobus, all the APIs, everything, put it into like a markdown folder somewhere, and then like they can just like interface with it like with an LLM, and it just utterly failed. It's not producing any good output yet. They're like, what does this mean? Like, it doesn't mean it doesn't make any sense yet. So I'm still hopeful. Like, I just haven't cracked the code yet, but I think it was really fun to try to see if I could help answer that question. It just didn't work out exactly the way I wanted to yet.
I'm curious if the models a year from now will allow that type of effort to work.
Even I'll bet you, if I just spent some amount of time prompt engineering and doing a little bit of agent engineering, I could probably get there. You know what I mean? But I think it's just going to require some like more experiments to unlock.
Yeah,
this.
nice.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much for coming on. It was a pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah, thank you both.
See you.